The engines were humming, the passengers settling in, when one voice shattered the calm, cruel, loud, and meant to wound. Every head turned. A woman sat frozen, her composure masking the storm beneath. She didn't argue. She didn't even look away. What no one knew was that the woman being mocked wasn't just another passenger. The real shock came moments later, when the same voice they tried to silence echoed across the cabin, not from the seats, but from the intercom. What happened next would make headlines around the world. It was supposed to be another routine flight. Captain Amara Lewis, 38, had flown this route more times than she could count. New York to London, 7 hours of sky, calm precision, and quiet professionalism. For 15 years, she'd built a reputation not through loud words, but through flawless takeoffs, smooth landings, and the steady confidence that comes from knowing your worth in a world that often questions it. Outside the terminal, the city buzzed in chaos, but inside Gate 17, Amara was focused, reviewing flight plans, exchanging nods with her crew, preparing for another day above the clouds. To her, the cockpit wasn't just a workspace, it was freedom. Up there, race, gender, and judgment faded into silence, but that morning the silence was fragile. The delay had passengers restless, frustration simmering just beneath polite smiles. Among them sat a man whose confidence came from privilege, not respect, someone about to remind Amara that prejudice doesn't always stay on the ground. She didn't know it yet, but before this plane ever lifted off, she'd be tested in ways no simulator could prepare her for. Boarding began like any other flight, orderly, polite, predictable. Captain Amara Lewis stood near the entrance, greeting passengers with the calm professionalism that came as naturally to her as breathing. Behind her uniform and practiced smile, she carried years of experience, storms weathered, turbulence conquered, and barriers broken one flight at a time. But as the crowd funneled in, she noticed him, the man in the tailored gray suit, sunglasses still on inside, impatience radiating like static. He brushed past the flight attendant, ignoring the boarding group announcement. "First class," he muttered, waving his platinum card as if it were a crown. His name tag flashed briefly on his briefcase. Richard Hale, executive of something, important enough in his own mind to treat others as background noise. Amara had seen his kind before, confidence without compassion, arrogance without awareness. As he reached the cabin door, their eyes met. For a moment he hesitated, not out of respect, but disbelief. Black woman in a pilot's uniform, 3 gold stripes on her shoulder. Authority where he didn't expect it. His smirk appeared before a word left his mouth. Amara greeted him anyway, steady and kind. "Welcome aboard, sir." He didn't answer, just a muttered chuckle under his breath, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Guess they'll let anyone fly now." A few people looked away, uncomfortable. Amara didn't flinch. Years of experience had taught her that silence could be louder than confrontation. Once the doors closed, she entered the cockpit, running through final checks. Outside the small glass window, the world looked peaceful. Inside the cabin, though, small sparks of tension were beginning to spread. Richard Hale wasn't done. As the plane taxied toward the runway, his voice carried over the murmur of passengers. Complaints about service, about delays, about the unprofessional crew. The flight attendants tried to calm him, but every word dripped with entitlement, and something darker beneath. When he saw Amara pass by on her way back to the cockpit, his tone sharpened. "That's the pilot?" he said loudly enough for others to hear. "You've got to be kidding me." Murmurs followed. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. One woman shook her head. Another took out her phone, instinctively recording. Amara didn't turn around, not yet. The engines roared to life, drowning out the tension, but not the feeling. As the plane climbed through the clouds, the cabin slowly quieted. For a moment, peace returned, until the seatbelt sign blinked off, and Richard's voice cut through again. He stood up abruptly, gesturing toward the cockpit. "I'm not flying across the ocean with her in charge," he snapped. The word "her" landed like a stone. Flight attendants rushed to intervene, but he stepped back, voice growing louder. "This is a joke." "Who hired her?" "I don't trust this diversity experiment with my life." Gasps spread through the cabin. Phones lifted. Eyes widened. And yet, Amara stayed calm. From the cockpit, she could hear every word. The insults, the disbelief, the hate disguised as concern. Her co-pilot glanced at her nervously. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. What she did next would define not just the flight, but her entire career. And the man in the gray suit was about to learn that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most power. The cabin was heavy with silence, broken only by the hum of engines and the sharp rhythm of Richard Hale's outrage. He stood near his seat, face flushed, voice booming over the crowd. Flight attendants pleaded with him to sit down, but he only grew louder, feeding off his own anger. Passengers stared. Some recorded, others whispered. But Amara, still seated in the cockpit, heard everything through her headset, every insult, every word dripping with disbelief that someone like her could be in command. Her pulse quickened, but her expression didn't change. Years of turbulence had taught her one thing: control was power. Then came the words that pierced the air like shrapnel. Go back to Africa. Gasps rippled through the plane. A child started crying. One of the attendants froze, her eyes wide. The co-pilot turned toward Amara, waiting for direction. Time seemed to slow, the kind of silence that weighs heavier than sound. Amara exhaled, slow, steady, then reached for the intercom. Her voice filled the cabin, calm but unyielding. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a passenger disturbance, we'll be returning to the gate." A wave of realization swept through the cabin. Richard's smirk faltered. Confusion replaced confidence. "You're joking," he said, but his voice cracked. The truth had landed harder than any turbulence. The woman he'd been mocking wasn't a flight attendant, wasn't a crew member he could belittle. She was the one in command. As the aircraft turned back toward the terminal, a strange quiet took over. Phones kept recording. Eyes stayed fixed on him. The self-proclaimed executive now looked smaller under the fluorescent lights, surrounded by the very people he'd once ignored. When the wheels touched the ground, Amara didn't look back. She didn't need to. Authority wasn't something she had to prove. It was already hers. And as security stepped on board, walking straight toward the man who thought he ruled the sky, every passenger finally understood. The real power in that cabin had never been his. When the aircraft rolled back to the gate, the tension that had filled the cabin finally broke. The door opened and two security officers stepped inside. Their footsteps echoed in the silence as they approached Richard Hale. The same man who had shouted with arrogance now looked lost, eyes darting from camera to camera as passengers recorded every second. No one spoke. No one defended him. And for once, he seemed to understand the weight of his own words. The confidence, the entitlement, the smugness, gone. He muttered something about misunderstanding, about not meaning it that way, but the world wasn't buying excuses anymore. When he was escorted off the plane, the silence turned into a quiet ripple of applause, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Not because people enjoyed watching someone fall, but because, for once, justice didn't look away. Captain Amara Lewis sat in the cockpit, steady hands resting on the controls. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply finished what she came to do, ensure every soul on board was safe. After all, her dignity didn't depend on someone else's disrespect. Hours later, the story exploded online. Headlines filled news feeds. Passenger removed after racist outburst. Pilot responds with grace. Clips of the incident went viral, replayed again and again. Her calm voice over the intercom, his red-faced anger fading into fear. The internet called her a hero, a symbol of quiet strength. But for Amara, it wasn't about fame. It was about truth, that respect isn't optional, and prejudice has no place in the skies. In interviews, she spoke softly but firmly. "I didn't raise my voice. I just did my job." Within days, Richard Hale's company released a statement condemning his behavior. His seat of power was gone, grounded by the very arrogance that once made him untouchable. Meanwhile, Amara's image became something far greater than a viral clip. It became a message that calm doesn't mean weak, and silence doesn't mean submission. Weeks later, at an aviation conference, Amara stood before hundreds of young pilots, women, men, people of every color and background, and shared the lesson that defined her flight. "Power isn't always about who speaks loudest," she said. "Sometimes it's about who keeps flying when others try to ground you." Her words echoed beyond that room, because this wasn't just her story. It was a mirror held up to a world still learning what equality truly means. So the question is, how many more moments like this must happen before dignity no longer has to be proven, but simply respected? If you believe respect should fly higher than hate, share this story and let the world know that silence may be safe, but courage changes everything.